Hello, how are you? Today, I'm going to tell you a story about medieval knights and ladies. Sit back, let yourself be swept away by the story, and drift off to sleep in peace. First, subscribe to my channel and leave a comment telling me what time you watched. Long before the age of gunpowder and printing presses. Before the great empires of modernity reshaped the map of the world, there existed a civilization built upon iron, faith, and the sworn oath of the warrior. This was the medieval world, a world of towering stone castles rising above misty valleys, of church bells echoing across silent forests, of muddy roads connecting villages where men and women lived and died within sight of the same hills where their grandparents had been born. It was a world governed not by laws we understand it today, but by loyalty to one's lord, loyalty to one's God, and loyal to the complex, demanding code that defined what it meant to be a knight. We tend to romanticize the Middle Ages, and that is perhaps understandable. The images are compelling: armored warriors on horseback, banners snapping in the wind above a tournament field, a lady dropping her favor from a high window as her champion rides below. But the reality of the medieval world was something far richer, far more contradictory, and far more human than any romance could capture. It was a world of genuine faith and genuine brutality, of extraordinary beauty and overwhelming suffering, of rigid social hierarchy and astonishing individual courage. To understand it properly, we must leave behind our modern assumptions and enter, with open minds, the long centuries that stretched from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. The period we call the Middle Ages spans roughly 1,000 years, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the emergence of the early modern world in the 5th. Within those 1,000 years, European civilization was rebuilt almost from nothing. The great roads of Rome crumbled. The cities emptied. The sophisticated administrative machinery of the empire dissolved into chaos. And from that chaos, slamefully, a new order emerged, an order based on the mounted warrior, the fortified stronghold, and the Christian church. It is within this context that the knight was born, not all at once, but gradually over generations, as the demands of warfare, the economics of land, and the aspirations of Christian civilization combined to create one of the most distinctive warrior classes in human history. And alongside the knight, shaped by the same world that shaped him, lived the women of the medieval nobility. Figures whose lives were constrained by law and custom in ways we would find intolerable today, yet who exercised a remarkable degree of influence, agency, and power within the world they inhabited. This is their story. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Knight. Carolingian origins. To understand the knight, we must begin not in the golden age of chivalry, but in the dark, turbulent centuries that preceded it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, it left behind a world in fragments. The Germanic tribes that had overwhelmed Rome, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons, were fierce warriors, but they were not administrators. They could conquer territory, they could not easily hold it. And so the former Roman provinces became a patchwork of Germany and northern Italy faced a particular challenge in the 8th century. The armies of Islam, having swept across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula with breathtaking speed, now threatened to pour through the mountain passes into the heart of Europe. It was Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, who stopped them at the Battle of Tours in 732, one of the most consequential battles in world history. And in doing so, he also laid the foundations for the knight. To defeat the Arab cavalry, which fought with a combination of speed, discipline, and stirrup-assisted stability that was new to European warfare. Charles Martel needed mounted warriors of his own. Cavalry was expensive. A single war horse, a destrier, the great battle horse bred for strength and courage, cost the equivalent of many years of a common laborer's wages. The equipment of a mounted warrior, from his chain-mail hauberk to his iron helmet, from his shield to his lance and sword, represented an enormous investment. Only wealthy men could equip themselves in this way, and only wealthy men could afford the years of training that effective mounted combat required. Charles Martel's solution was to distribute church lands to his warriors in exchange for military service. This was the birth of feudalism, the system by which land was granted in exchange for military obligation that would define European society for the next several centuries. The warrior who received land became a vassal. The lord who granted it became his liege. The relationship was sealed by an oath, sworn on holy relics, that bound both parties in a web of mutual obligation that was as much spiritual as it was political. Charlemagne, who built upon his grandfather's foundations to create the greatest European empire since Rome, refined and expanded this system. Under his rule, the mounted warrior, still not yet called a knight, but already recognizable as the ancestor of that figure, became the central institution of Carolingian military power. Charlemagne issued detailed capitularies, royal decrees, specifying exactly what equipment his vassals were required to maintain. A man who held a certain amount of land must provide a horse, a shield, a lance, a sword, a dagger, and a bow with a quiver of arrows. The wealthier the vassal, the more extensive the military obligation. But it was not only equipment that Charlemagne demanded. He also demanded that his warriors be capable of using it effectively. This meant training, long, systematic, physically demanding training that began in boyhood and continued throughout a man's active military life. The Carolingian court became a center not only of government and religion, but of military education. And the sons of great lords came to serve at court as pages, and then as young warriors, learning the arts of war from the most experienced soldiers in the realm. When Charlemagne died in 814 and his empire was divided among his quarrelsome grandsons, the system he had built survived the political fragmentation. Indeed, in some ways it thrived under fragmentation, because the endless warfare between competing petty lords created a constant demand for skilled mounted warriors. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the figure of the miles, the Latin word for soldier, which would eventually evolve into the medieval concept of knighthood, was becoming recognizable across Europe. He was a man defined by his horse, his weapons, his oath of loyalty, and increasingly by a set of values that distinguished him from the ordinary foot soldier. Those values were still rough, still raw, still very much the values of a warrior culture that measured prestige in plunder and glory in combat. But they were beginning to be refined by forces that would transform the brutal miles of the Carolingian era and into the knight of the high medieval period. And chief among those forces was the Christian Church. Chapter 20: The Church and the Sword. First, Christianizing violence. The relationship between Christianity and warfare is one of the great paradoxes of medieval civilization. Christianity, at its theological core, is a religion of peace. Its founder was executed rather than resist his captors. Its central commandment is love, love of God, love of neighbor, love even of one's enemy. And yet, from very early in its history, the Christian Church found itself in an uneasy alliance with the warrior class, an alliance that would eventually produce one of the most elaborate ideological justifications for violence Western civilization has ever developed. The problem was simple enough. The church needed protection. In a world without a stable central government, without professional police forces, without any reliable mechanism for maintaining order, the only protection available was military force. And military force was provided by men who killed for a living. How could an institution dedicated to the teachings of the Prince of Peace maintain itself in such a world without coming to terms with those men and their violent profession? The Church's answer, developed over centuries by theologians and bishops, was the doctrine of the just war, drawing on the writings of Saint Augustine of Hippo, who had written in the 5th century about the conditions under which violence might be morally acceptable. Medieval theologians constructed an elaborate framework that distinguished between wars fought for worldly gain and wars fought in defense of the innocent, in service of justice, or in the cause of God. Violence that fell within this framework was not merely tolerated, it was sanctified. The warrior who fought in a just cause was not sinning. He was performing a Christian duty. This theological foundation made possible a remarkable cultural project, the Christianization of the warrior class. Beginning in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Church began to develop rituals and ceremonies that transformed the act of becoming a warrior from a purely secular affair into a religious one. The blessing of weapons, swords, lances, shields, by priests became common practice. The knight who received his arms at a ceremony increasingly did so in a church, or at least in the presence of a priest. The oath he swore upon taking up his martial role was sworn not merely to his Lord but to God. The Peace of God movement, which emerged in southern France in the late 10th century, was perhaps the most ambitious expression of the Church's effort to regulate and moralize warfare. Councils of bishops, attended by great lords and vast crowds of ordinary people, proclaimed that certain categories of people were immune from attack. The clergy, obviously, but also women, children, merchants, and peasants. The warrior who attacked such people was not merely breaking a Sceaux convention. He was violating a sacred prohibition, made holy by the authority of the Church, and backed by the threat of excommunication. A few decades later, the Truce of God extended this protection to certain times as well as certain people. Fighting was forbidden on Sundays or religious holidays, and during the seasons Advent and Lent. In theory, this left only about 80 days a year on which legitimate warfare could occur. In practice, the truce was honored more in the breach than in the observance. But the ideology it represented was powerful and enduring. That warfare was not simply a natural human activity, but one that required moral justification and was subject to divine judgment. It was against this background that the ceremony of knighthood took on its full religious significance. By the 11th century, the dubbing ceremony, formal act by which a young man became a knight, had become an elaborate liturgical ritual. The night before his dubbing, the candidate was expected to spend in the church, in prayer and fasting, performing a vigil of arms, in which he dedicated his martial skills to God. The following morning, he bathed, a ritual purification, and dressed in white garments symbolizing purity. He heard Mass, he received communion. And then, in a ceremony presided over by his lord or another senior knight, he was invested with his sword, his spurs, and his shield, each accompanied by prayers and admonitions about the duties of Christian knighthood. The sword, in particular, acquired deep symbolic significance. In the Church's understanding, the sword of the knight was not merely a weapon but a sacramental object, a tool consecrated to divine purposes. Its two edges represented the dual obligation of the knight: to defend the faith against its enemies, and to protect the weak and helpless against the strong. The point of the sword directed the knight's gaze toward heaven, reminding him that his ultimate loyalty was to God rather than to any earthly lord. and the cross formed by the hilt was an explicit reminder that the knight's martial life was lived under the sign of the cross, in imitation, however imperfect, of the sacrifice of Christ. This fusion of martial and religious values produced a distinctive ethos that we recognize as chivalry, a word derived from the French cheval, meaning horse, but which came to denote a complex system of moral and social values that governed the conduct of the mounted warrior class. Chivalry was never a single, fixed code. It varied by time, by region, by the social status and personal character of individual knights. But at its core, it embodied a set of ideals that distinguished the true knight from the mere hired sword: loyalty, courage, generosity, piety, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Whether medieval knights actually lived up to these ideals is a separate question, and one we will address in due course. But the ideals themselves were real, widely disseminated, and genuinely influential on the self-understanding of the warrior class. To be a knight was not merely to be a skilled fighter. It was to aspire to a particular moral identity, to measure oneself against a demanding standard of conduct, and to participate in a shared culture of values and stories that gave meaning to the violent, precarious business of medieval warfare. Chapter 3. Training a knight. From page to squire to warrior, the making of a knight was a long, expensive, and physically demanding process that occupied the first 2 decades of a young man's life. It was not a matter of simply picking up a sword and learning to swing it. It was a comprehensive education in the arts of war, the obligations of lordship, the manners of the court, and the values of Christian chivalry. An education that began almost as soon as a boy could walk. The sons of the nobility typically left their family homes at around the age of 7 to begin their training in another lord's household. This practice, which might seem cruel by modern standards, and gave their sons access to better training, broader social networks, and more prestigious connections than they could have obtained at home. The boy who served as a page in a great lord's household might train alongside the sons of counts and dukes, form friendships that would serve him throughout his life, and learn by direct observation how powerful men governed and fought. As a page, a boy's duties were menial but instructive. He served at table, learning the elaborate etiquette, aristocratic dining. He ran errands for the knights of the household. He helped with the horses and the equipment. He learned to ride, not just to sit on a horse, but to control a powerful animal at full gallop while keeping his balance and his hands free. He practiced with wooden weapons, learning the basic techniques of sword fighting, spear handling, and shield work. He received instruction from the chaplain in reading, writing, and the basics of Christian doctrine. And he listened constantly to the stories of great knights and great battles that formed the oral culture of the aristocracy. Around the age of 14, if his training had gone well, a page might be advanced to the rank of squire. The squire was a young man in training for knighthood, and his duties and responsibilities increased dramatically with this promotion. He became the personal attendant of a knight, responsible for the care and maintenance of that knight's equipment. This was no small task. A knight's equipment in the high medieval period was extraordinarily complex and expensive. His suit of mail, the hauberk made of thousands of individually linked iron rings, had to be kept clean of rust, which in the damp climate of northern Europe was a constant battle. It was typically stored in a bag of sand and periodically rolled and tumbled to scour away the rust that inevitably formed. His helmet, his gauntlets, his greaves, his surcoat, all required constant attention. The squire also cared for the knight's horses, and a knight of any importance might have several. Destrier, the great war horse, was the most valuable and required the most careful attention. These animals were extraordinarily expensive, the equivalent in modern terms of a luxury sports car, and their training was as demanding as that of the knights who rode them. The destrier had to be trained to charge into the chaos of battle without flinching, to respond to subtle cues from its rider's legs and weight, to bite and kick at enemies on command. A squire who aspired to knighthood needed to understand horses thoroughly, because his effectiveness as a knight would depend on his ability to work in seamless partnership with his mount. In battle, the squire accompanied his knight, carrying spare weapons and equipment, and was expected to come to his knight's aid if he was unhorsed or wounded. This was genuinely dangerous work. Medieval battles were chaotic, brutal affairs in which the line between combatant and non-combatant was often unclear, and squires who attended their knights in battle faced the same risks as the knights themselves. Many young men died as squires before they ever achieved the rank of knight. This was understood and accepted. Death in battle in service of a righteous cause was not a tragedy in the medieval worldview, it was an honorable end. But the squire's education was not only martial. The great lords' households of the high medieval period were increasingly sophisticated cultural institutions, centers of music, poetry, and what we would recognize as courtly culture. The squire was expected to learn to play a musical instrument. The lute and the harp were popular, and to have some competence in singing. He was expected to be able to compose verses, or at least to appreciate them. He was expected to know the stories of the great heroes of the past, the legendary King Arthur and his knights, the paladins of Charlemagne, the heroes of Troy. He was expected to be able to conduct himself gracefully in the company of ladies, to converse with charm and wit, to dance with skill and elegance. This courtly education was not merely decorative. It was the mechanism by which the warrior class was made fit for the responsibilities of governance. The great lords of medieval Europe were not simply warriors. They were administrators, judges, diplomats, and patrons of culture. The education of their sons had to prepare them for all these roles, not merely for the battlefield. A man who could only fight was useful but limited. A man who could fight, govern, negotiate, charm, and inspire, that was a knight in the fullest sense of the term. The question of when a squire became a knight had no single answer. In theory, the transition happened at a formal ceremony of dubbing, typically when the young man was in his late teens or early 20s. In practice, the timing varied enormously. Some men were knighted very young, barely more than boys, if they had distinguished themselves in battle, or if their lord political reasons for honoring them. Others served as squires for much longer, waiting until they had the resources to maintain the expensive lifestyle that knighthood required, or until they had found a lord willing to sponsor their dubbing. For the ceremony itself was not free. The new knight needed equipment: a horse, a sword, armor, a shield. He needed a household, however modest, at least a servant or two, a stable, a supply of food and fodder. He was expected to celebrate his knighting with a feast, to display the generosity that was one of the cardinal virtues of knighthood. All of this cost money, and for younger sons of modest families who had not yet received lands of their own, the financial barrier to knighthood could be significant. Many men who had completed their training and were technically qualified to be knights chose to remain squires for years because they could not afford the transition. When the moment finally came, the ceremony of dubbing transformed everything. Before it, he was a servant, a trainee, a young man of promise. After it, he was a knight of the realm, a member of the most prestigious warrior caste in Europe, a man who had sworn his sword to God and his loyalty to his lord. He wore his spurs, the golden spurs that were the badge of knighthood, with a pride that was not merely personal vanity, but the expression of a deep cultural investment. He had become what his civilization most admired, a Miles Christianus, a Christian soldier, a servant of both God and man. Chapter 4. The Arsenal of Chivalry, Weapons, Armor, and the Destroyer. To understand the medieval knight, one must understand his equipment, because equipment was not merely as of his trade, but that the physical expression of his identity, his status, and his relationship to the world. A knight's weapons and armor were among the most sophisticated manufactured objects of their era, the products of specialized craftsmen who spent years mastering their trade and who passed their knowledge down through generations of carefully trained apprentices. And at the center of it all was the horse, without whom the knight was, quite literally, no knight at all. Let us begin with the sword, for no weapon was more central to the identity and mythology of knighthood. The medieval sword evolved considerably over the 5 centuries of the high medieval period, from the broad, single-handed weapon of the early Middle Ages to the more refined, cross-hilted sword that we recognize from countless illustrations and surviving examples. At its most typical, the knight's sword of the 11th and 12th centuries was a double-edged weapon about 30 inches long, with a blade that tapered gradually from the hilt to the point. It was designed primarily for cutting, for the sweeping strokes that could wound or kill an opponent through gaps in his armor, or simply through the sheer force of impact even against armored targets. But the sword was also a thrusting weapon, and as armor improved over the course of the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, progressing from chainmail alone, augmented by plate armor, and eventually to the full harness of plates that we associate with the 15th century, the design of swords evolved to meet the new challenge. The later medieval sword tended to have a longer, narrower, more acutely pointed blade, better suited for finding the gaps between plates, or for driving through the mail that protected the joints. Some specialized weapons, known as estocks or tucks, were essentially rigid iron rods with a handle designed almost exclusively for thrusting into the vulnerable points of a man in full plate armor. The making of a good sword was an art of extraordinary complexity. The smith began with raw iron, which had to be repeatedly heated and hammered to drive out impurities and create steel of consistent quality. Different parts of the blade might be made from iron of different carbon contents, with the hard, high-carbon steel used for the cutting edge and softer, more flexible iron used for the body of the blade. This differential construction gave the finished sword a combination of hardness and flexibility that pure steel alone could not achieve: hard enough to hold a sharp edge, flexible enough not to shatter under the shock of combat. The best swords were the products of years of accumulated craft knowledge, and a truly exceptional sword was as prized as a horse or a suit of armor. The knight's other primary weapons included the lance, the warhammer, the mace, and the battle-axe. The lance was the quintessential knightly weapon, the long wooden shaft, tipped with an iron or steel head, that was couched under the arm and driven into the opponent at the combined speed of 2 galloping horses. At the moment of impact, the energy transmitted through the lance was enormous, enough to unhorse a rider, to punch through heavy armor, or to kill a man outright. The skill of managing a lance at full gallop, keeping it steady, directing it accurately, absorbing the shock of impact without being unhorsed oneself, was one of the most demanding techniques in the knightly repertoire, requiring years of practice to master. As armor improved, edged and pointed weapons became less effective against armored opponents, and blunt ones gained in importance. The mace, essentially a heavy metal head on a wooden or metal handle, was designed to crush and deform armor rather than penetrate it, driving the metal into the flesh beneath, or simply breaking bones through the medium of the armor. The warhammer served a similar purpose, and its pointed back could be used to punch through plate armor at close range. These were brutal, utilitarian weapons, lacking the elegance of the sword, but often more effective against the heavily armored opponents that knights increasingly faced as the Middle Ages progressed. The armor that the knight wore evolved dramatically over the medieval period, and the story of that evolution is essentially the story of an ongoing arms race between offensive and defensive technology. The knight of the 9th, 10th centuries typically wore a hauberk of chainmail, a long garment made of thousands of interlocked iron rings, covering the body from the neck to the knees. Mail was remarkably effective against cutting weapons. A sharp blade that would slice through cloth or leather would simply catch in the rings of mail without penetrating. But mail offered much less protection against the crushing blows of blunt weapons or the thrusting point of a spear or arrow. A mail-clad warrior could be seriously injured by a blow simply drove the rings of his armor into his flesh, and an arrow fired from a powerful bow could penetrate mail at close range. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, knights began to supplement their mail with additional protection. Padded gambesons, quilted garments stuffed with linen or wool, were worn beneath the mail to provide cushioning against impact. Rigid leather reinforcements were added to the elbows and knees, and increasingly, plates of iron or steel were added at the most vulnerable points: the shoulders, the shins, the forearms. This hybrid mail and plate armor of the high medieval period was less elegant than the full harness of late Middle Ages, but it also more flexible and easier to manufacture. The full plate harness, which reached its peak development in the 15th century, was a masterwork of the armorer's craft, covering the body from head to toe in carefully shaped and fitted plates of steel. It provided extraordinary protection, not by simply presenting an impenetrable barrier, but by deflecting blows away from the body through the clever shaping of the plates. Swords and spears that struck a well-made suit of plate armor were more likely to glance off than to penetrate, and the articulated construction of the harness, with each plate connected to its neighbors by leather straps and sliding rivets, allowed the wearer to move with surprising freedom. Contemporary accounts describe knights in full armor climbing ladders, performing somersaults, and mounting horses without assistance. The armor was heavy. A full harness might weigh 60 or 70 pounds, but that weight was distributed evenly across the body, making it far less debilitating than it sounds. But of all the components of the knight's military equipment, none was more important than his horse. The destrier, the great war horse of the medieval period, was not simply a means of transportation. It was a weapon in its own right, and a partner in combat as essential as any sword or lance. These animals were bred over generations for a combination of size, strength, courage, and responsiveness that made them unlike ordinary horses in almost every way. They were enormous by medieval standards, the products of deliberate selective breeding from the largest and most powerful animals available. And they were trained to work as extensions of their rider's will, responding to the subtlest shifts of weight and pressure from the knight's legs and seat. The training of a destrier was as long and demanding as the training of the knight who would ride it. Beginning as young foals, these horses were gradually habituated to the noise, smoke, and chaos of battle, to the sound of trumpets, drums, to the smell of blood, to the sight of other horses falling dead or wounded around them. They were taught to attack enemies on command, using their hooves and teeth as additional weapons. They were trained to carry a knight in full armor at full gallop, while maintaining direction and responding to commands. This training required years of patient, skilled work, and the best war horses were worth enormous sums. In some periods, the equivalent of 10 or 15 years of a common laborer's wages. The loss of his horse in battle was one of the worst things that could happen to a knight. Without his horse, he was dramatically less effective as a warrior, slower, more vulnerable, denied the advantage of height and speed that made the mounted knights so formidable. In battle, the killing of an opponent's horse was a deliberate tactic, aimed at neutralizing the most dangerous enemy warriors. And the unhorsing of a knight, whether by killing his horse or by striking him with enough force to throw him from the saddle, was often the prelude to his capture or death. The economics of knightly equipment deserve a moment's attention, because had profound implications for the social structure of medieval Europe. A full set of military equipment, horse, armor, weapons, a second horse for travel, and the servants needed to care for all of it, represented an investment that was simply beyond the means of ordinary people. In the 11th century, a knight's equipment cost roughly the equivalent of 40 or 50 cows. A staggering sum in an agricultural society where most families owned no more than 2 or 3. By the late medieval period, as armor became more sophisticated and the demands of warfare more complex, the cost had risen still further. This economic reality meant that knighthood was, by definition, a privilege of the wealthy. A man might have the courage, the skill, and the character to make an excellent knight. But if he'd not have the financial resources to equip himself, he could never join the mounted warrior elite. The feudal system was, in part, a mechanism for ensuring that those who had the resources to be knights were also given the land, the economic foundation needed to maintain their status. And this in turn meant that the identity of the knight was inseparable from the identity of the landowner, the lord, the member of the governing class of medieval society. Chapter 5. The Tournament. Theater of chivalry. If the battlefield was where knights tested themselves in deadly earnest, the tournament was where they displayed themselves in something approaching spectacle. A controlled, ritualized form of combat that served simultaneously as military training, social theater, and economic enterprise. The tournament was one of the most distinctive institutions of medieval European culture, and its history illuminates much about the values, the social dynamics, and the contradictions of the chivalric world. The tournament in its earliest form was not the carefully regulated pageant we might imagine from later depictions. The earliest tournaments, which appear in the historical record in the late 11th century, were essentially large-scale brawls, melees they were called, in which two groups of knights fought each other across an area of open countryside that might cover several square miles. The goal was to capture opponents and hold them for ransom. A successful tournament participant could earn enormous sums by unhorsing wealthy knights and claiming their horses and armor as prizes. The most skilled tournament fighters of the 12th century made what was essentially a professional career of the circuit, moving from tournament to tournament across France, England, and the Low Countries, building reputations and fortunes through their prowess. The dangers were very real. Men died in tournaments, and serious injury was common. The weapons used were technically blunted. The lances had blunt tips rather than sharp points. The swords were not razor-edged. But in the chaos of a melee, with dozens of mounted warriors charging and countercharging across open ground, the difference between a blunted and a sharp weapon was often academic. Horses fell on their riders. Men were trampled. Combatants who fell into ditches or against walls were sometimes killed by opponents who kept fighting without realizing they had unhorsed a man who was no longer capable of defending himself. The church, predictably, disapproved of tournaments, not because of their violence, which was at least arguably defensible within the framework of just war theory, but because of the deaths they caused and the pride and vanity they encouraged. Several popes issued decrees condemning tournaments and threatening participants with excommunication. They had limited success. The tournament was too deeply embedded in the culture and economy of the knightly class for ecclesiastical disapproval to suppress it. At most, the Church's opposition encouraged a gradual evolution of the tournament towards somewhat safer forms. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the tournament was becoming more elaborate, more regulated, and more explicitly theatrical. The joust, single combat between two mounted knights, each carrying a lance, charging toward each other along a central barrier, emerged as the most popular form of tournament combat. The joust was safer than the melee, not because the physical risks were dramatically lower, but because its confined, well-defined format made it easier to control. There was a clear beginning and end to each encounter. The combatants were separated by the central barrier so that their horses could not collide. And the rules governing when a lance strike scored a point were increasingly explicit. The scoring system of the joust evolved over time and varied by region, but typically awarded points for breaking lances. A lance that shattered on impact was evidence of a clean, powerful strike, and for unhorsing the opponent, which was the most decisive possible outcome. 3 runs was typical, though this could vary. A knight who broke the most lances or who unhorsed his opponent won the encounter. A knight who struck his opponent's horse, or who was judged to have used his lance dishonorably, lost points. And a knight who fled from the field, refused to joust, or broke the rules of the encounter was subject to public humiliation, having his lance broken and thrown in the dust as a sign of his disgrace. The theatrical quality of the tournament became more pronounced over time. By the 13th and 14th centuries, great tournaments were organized events that required months of preparation and attracted participants from across Europe. They were preceded by elaborate ceremonies, feasts, and assemblies at which the rules and prizes were announced. Participants arrived with elaborate heraldic displays, the distinctive devices of their coats of arms painted on their shields, embroidered on their surcoats, flying from the pennants on their lances. And these heraldic displays became an important form of social communication, identifying the participants and signaling their lineage, their allegiances, and their status. Heraldry, indeed, was one of the great cultural products of the tournament culture. The need to identify mounted warriors in the confusion of a melee, or to recognize a jousting knight at speed, drove the development of an increasingly complex system of visual symbols that eventually became of the most elaborate classificatory systems in European history. Each noble family had its own arms, a specific combination of colors, shapes, and symbols that was unique to that family, and was passed down through the generations, with modifications to distinguish younger sons and cadet branches from the senior line. The heralds who maintained and adjudicated this system became important officials at tournaments, announcing participants, judging disputes about armorial right, and keeping the records that accumulated into enormous reference works of European noble genealogy. The prizes at tournaments were not merely practical. They were symbolic objects that carried the weight of honor. A prize helmet, a prize shield, a valuable ring or jewel. These were tokens of distinction that a knight might display in his hall for the rest of his life. Visible evidence of his prowess and his reputation. And tournaments increasingly featured special prizes, particular kinds of excellence. Prize for the knight who had maintained the most challenging vigil before the tournament. the prize for the knight who had displayed the greatest courtesy to defeated opponents, the prize for the knight whose appearance and equipment were judged the most magnificent. These prizes reflected the multidimensional nature of chivalric excellence. The ideal knight was not merely the most dangerous fighter, but the most honorable, the most generous, and the most magnificent. The ladies of the court were an essential presence at tournaments from very early in their history. They were the audience for whom, in a very real sense, the spectacle was performed. They sat in the galleries and stands that were erected around the tournament field, watching the combatants with an attention that was as evaluative as it was appreciative. A knight who fought well, who displayed courage and skill and courtesy even in defeat, enhanced his reputation in the eyes of the women, as surely as he enhanced it in the eyes of his male peers. And conversely, a knight who fought poorly, who showed fear or behaved dishonorably, suffered a social humiliation that was all the more acute for being witnessed by women whose good opinion he coveted. The role of ladies in the tournament went beyond mere spectatorship. It was customary for a knight to fight in honor of a lady, to wear her token on his helmet or lance, to dedicate his performance to her, and to present his winnings to her if he emerged victorious. This practice, which blended the martial and the romantic in characteristically medieval fashion, gave women a formal role in the tournament as patrons of knightly valor. The lady who awarded the prize at the end of a tournament, the Queen of Beauty, she was sometimes called, held a position of genuine symbolic authority, and the knight she favored was marked out as her champion, her defender, the living expression of her power to inspire and reward masculine excellence. This connection between the tournament and the culture of courtly love is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval chivalric culture, and we will explore it in much greater depth when we turn to the lives of medieval women. For now, it is enough to note that the tournament was not only a military institution but a cultural one, a space in which the values of chivalry were dramatized, tested, and performed for an audience that included both men and women, and in which the aspirations of knightly culture found their most vivid and memorable expression. Chapter 6: War in Earnest. The knight. On the battlefield, the tournament was theater. The battlefield was reality. And the reality of medieval warfare was something very different from the romanticized images of chivalric combat that later centuries would celebrate in art and literature. It was dirty, brutal, exhausting, terrifying, and often decided less by individual valor than by logistics, strategy, disease, and the simple ability to keep an army in the field long enough to wear down the enemy. Medieval warfare was almost constantly present in the lives of the knightly class. The relative peace of a year or two was the exception rather than the rule. Disputes over land, succession, and honor, all the things that mattered most in a society built on hereditary privilege and personal loyalty, generated a steady supply of conflicts, from local feuds between neighboring lords to great international wars that consumed entire generations. The knight who had not experienced actual combat was a relative rarity, and the knight who had experienced a great deal of it was far from unusual. The pitched battle, the great encounter of two armies in open field, was actually relatively rare in medieval warfare. Despite occupying the center of the chivalric imagination, most medieval warfare was conducted through siege, raid, and strategic maneuver, rather than through the dramatic clash of arms that features so prominently in chronicles and romances. The reasons for this were largely practical. A pitched battle was an enormous gamble. Even a superior army could lose if it stumbled into an ambush, if its horses were exhausted by a forced march, if its infantry was demoralized by shortage of food, or or if the enemy chose a position that neutralized the attacker's advantages. The potential gains from winning a battle had to be weighed against the catastrophic consequences of losing one, and most experienced commanders preferred the slower, safer strategies of attrition. Siege warfare was therefore the dominant form of military activity in medieval Europe. The great castles that punctuate the European landscape were not merely symbols of power. They were the central strategic reality of medieval warfare. A castle properly garrisoned and provisioned could resist almost any attacker for months or years. Its fall required either the active treachery of someone within, the betrayal of a gate or the corruption of a garrison commander, or the slow attrition of a siege, during which the besieging force had to keep itself supplied and motivated while cutting off the besieged from food. Reinforcement. The tactics of siege were various and ingenious. Battering rams suspended in wheeled frames were brought to bear against gates and walls. Siege towers, enormous wooden structures built on wheels, could be pushed up to castle walls, allowing attackers to fight their way onto the battlements. Catapults and trebuchets, the latter among the most formidable machines of the medieval world, hurled massive stones against walls and towers, gradually battering them down. Miners dug tunnels beneath the foundations of towers, propping up their tunnels with wooden supports, and then setting those supports on fire, causing the tunnel to collapse and bringing down the wall above. The defenders were not passive recipients of this treatment. They had their own arsenal of countermeasures. Boiling oil or water could be poured down on attackers approaching the walls. Sorties, quick raids from gates or posterns, could disrupt siege works and kill workers. Countermines could be dug to intercept the attackers' tunnels, and the mere fact of a castle's continued resistance was a statement of strategic defiance. Every week that a garrison held out was a week during which the besieging army consumed food, suffered from disease, and gave its enemies time to organize a relief force. When pitched battles did occur, the role of the knight was central, at least in the opening phases, before the increasing effectiveness of infantry tactics in the 14th and 15th centuries began to challenge the dominance of mounted cavalry. The classic knightly charge was one of the most terrifying things on the medieval battlefield. A force of heavily armored knights, mounted on destriers and carrying lances, charging in formation at full gallop, generated a combination of visual impact, noise, and physical force that was almost impossible for poorly trained infantry to withstand. The thundering of hooves, the glittering of armor, the lowered lances forming a hedge of iron points advancing at the speed of a galloping horse. These things broke the morale of many armies before they made contact. But the charge was not invulnerable. If an infantry force could be made to hold its ground and present a wall of spears or pikes, the horses, which were, unlike their riders, unarmored below the neck, would often refuse to impale themselves on the points. A horse, even a trained destrier, would typically shy away from a hedge of spear points rather than drive itself onto them. This meant that a cavalry charge against well-organized spearmen was likely to break against the defensive line rather than through it, unless the spearmen broke first from the psychological pressure of the charge. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where a Scottish spear phalanx destroyed an English cavalry force that had far greater numbers and individual quality, was only the most famous of several encounters that demonstrated the limits of knightly cavalry against determined infantry. The development of the longbow, deployed by English archers in devastating effect at battles including Crecy in 1546 and Agincourt in 4th Form 15, further complicated the equation. A trained English longbowman could release 10 or 12 arrows per minute. each capable of penetrating mail at ranges of up to 200 yards and plate armor at closer range. Against a force of longbowmen properly deployed on ground that favored their use, a cavalry charge was not merely risky, it was suicidal. The great French defeats of the 100 Years' War were essentially catastrophic demonstrations of this truth, as the flower of French chivalry rode repeatedly into storms of arrows that brought down their horses and killed or wounded riders as they struggled to rise from the ground in their heavy armor. The response of the knightly class to these tactical challenges was revealing. Rather than abandon cavalry warfare entirely, knights adapted. Dismounted knights, fighting on foot in close formation, proved surprisingly effective against both archers and enemy infantry. The armor that was a disadvantage when trying to charge through arrows became an advantage when fighting hand to hand. The English use of dismounted knights in combination with longbowmen proved the dominant tactical system of the 100 Years' War, and it was a system that still placed the knight at the center of the military enterprise. For all its violence and brutality, medieval warfare was governed by conventions that reflected, however imperfectly, the chivalric values of the warrior class. Chief among these was the convention of ransom. A knight taken prisoner in battle was typically not killed. He was captured and held for a ransom commensurate with his rank and wealth. This convention had obvious economic logic. A dead enemy yielded nothing, while a live prisoner could yield a great deal. But it also had a moral dimension rooted in the shared identity of the knightly class. Knights recognized each other as members of the same caste, governed by the same values, deserving of the same respect, even in defeat. To kill a knight who had surrendered was a violation of the chivalric code, an act of barbarism that could seriously damage the perpetrator's reputation. The ransom system created some remarkable situations. The Black Prince, the son of the English King Edward III, famously entertained the captured French King John II at dinner after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, serving him personally and treating him with every mark of respect, before sending him to England to negotiate his enormous ransom. This was not hypocrisy. It was the genuine expression of a culture that believed warfare and honor were not contradictory, that a defeated enemy deserved courtesy precisely because his defeat demonstrated that he had fought bravely for his lord. Not all enemies, of course, were treated with such courtesy. The conventions of chivalry applied most reliably when both sides shared the same culture, when both were Christian, when both recognized the same social hierarchy, when both were bound by the same code of honor. Against enemies who were outside this framework, against pagans, against peasant rebels, against mercenaries who followed no code, the conventions broke down quickly and completely. The massacres of the Crusades, the brutal suppression of peasant uprisings, the destruction of towns and villages by ravaging armies. These were not aberrations from the chivalric ideal, but its shadow, the darkness that followed wherever the light of the code failed to reach. Chapter 7. The Crusades. Gauls, warriors in the Holy Land. No episode in the history of medieval knighthood is more dramatic, more debated, or more consequential than the Crusades. The series of military expeditions launched by Western Christendom between 1996 and 1001 with the avowed purpose of recovering the Holy Land from Muslim control. The Crusades were the fullest expression of the fusion between martial and religious values that defined medieval knighthood, and they produced both extraordinary heroism and extraordinary atrocity, often within the same campaign and sometimes within the same day. The immediate trigger for the First Crusade was a sermon preached by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in November 1095, Urban was responding to a request from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who sought Western military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, who had conquered most of Anatolia following the catastrophic Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. But Urban transformed this request for mercenaries into something far more ambitious: a call to holy war for the liberation of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's burial, from the hands of the infidel. The response was overwhelming, and it surprised everyone, including Urban himself. Knights, nobles, and commoners across France, Germany, and the Low Countries took up the cross, literally sewing cloth crosses onto their garments as a symbol of their vow to reach Jerusalem. The motives of the Crusaders were as varied as the Crusaders themselves. Some were driven by genuine religious fervor, a desire to defend the holy places of Christianity, and to earn the spiritual rewards that Urban had promised to all who took the cross. Some were driven by the prospected adventure and plunder in the wealthy lands of the East. Some were younger sons with no inheritance, for whom the crusade offered both glory and the possibility of carving out lordships in conquered territory. And some were driven by the complex combination of all these things that defies simple psychological reduction. The First Crusade is one of the most astonishing military achievements of the Middle Ages. An army of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 people, knights, infantry, non-combatant, priests, women, and children, marched 3,000 miles from France to Jerusalem across terrain that would have challenged a modern army with logistical support. And at the end of that journey, fought and won a series of battles against experienced opponents. They took Antioch after a brutal 8-month siege in 1098. They survived a devastating famine and a counter-siege that nearly destroyed them. And in July 1099, they stormed Jerusalem itself in a battle that ended in a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish population that was widely celebrated in the West as a victory for God and widely condemned in the Muslim world as an act of barbaric savagery. The establishment of the Crusader states, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and its dependent principalities, created a permanent Western presence in the Eastern Mediterranean that would last for nearly 2 centuries. And it created a new institution that perfectly embodied the fusion of monastic and martial values: the military order. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119, were the first and most famous of these orders. Its members were knights who had taken monastic vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who dedicated their lives to the defense of pilgrims and the Holy Land. They combined the rigorous discipline and collective organization of the monastery with the martial skills and equipment of the knight, creating a fighting force that was both ideologically committed and professionally effective. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded as a charitable organization to care for sick pilgrims, similarly evolved into a military order. The Teutonic Knights, originally established to care for German crusaders, would eventually redirect their mission northward, waging a long campaign of Christian expansion against the pagan peoples of the Baltic. All 3 of these great military orders produced some of the most skilled warriors of the medieval period and served as important conduits for the flow of military knowledge, equipment, and technique between East and West. The Second Crusade, launched in 1140-47 in response to the fall of the county of Edessa to the Muslim ruler Zangi, was a failure. 2 great armies, one led by the French King Louis Saata and his Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, the other led by the German Emperor Conrad III, marched to the east and achieved essentially nothing. The siege of Damascus, which might have secured a major strategic objective, was abandoned after only a few days. in circumstances that remain mysterious and controversial. The Crusaders returned home having accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the gap between crusading aspiration and military reality. The Third Crusade, which followed the catastrophic defeat of the Christian army at the Horns of Hattin, in Nonwards in E7 A.E. Saladin, and the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, produced the most famous encounter in crusading history. The contest between Saladin and Richard I of England, known to posterity as Richard the Lionheart. The two men never met in person, but the record of their conflict, preserved in both Christian and Muslim sources, illustrates better than almost any other episode the complex relationship between chivalric ideals and the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Richard was everything the chivalric ideal demanded: brave, generous, physically imposing, person admitted to the obligations of knighthood. He was also ruthless when he judged ruthlessness to be necessary. After the fall of Acre in 191, he ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men who had been promised their lives as part of the surrender agreement. This act, which shocked even some of his contemporaries, was almost certainly motivated by practical calculation. He could not feed so many prisoners, could not spare troops to guard them, and could not afford to have them freed to fight against him again. But it was also a profound violation of the chivalric code that he was supposed to embody. Saladin, by contrast, was depicted by Christian chroniclers in terms that came close to the chivalric ideal itself. When he recaptured Jerusalem in 1087, he allowed the Christian population to leave peacefully, in stark contrast to the massacre of 1099. He was known for ransoming Christian captives, for sending gifts of fruit and snow-cooled water to Richard during his illness, for the elaborate courtesies he exchanged with the enemy commanders he faced. The fact that Christian writers could depict a Muslim ruler as more chivalrous than many Christian knights says something important about the gap between the ideal and the reality of chivalry, and about the genuinely international character of the code of honor that governed the warrior elite of medieval period. Chapter 8. Woman of the Castle, Life Beyond the Walls. We have spent much of our story so far following knights across battlefields and tournament grounds, through sieges and crusades, across the full violent landscape of medieval military life. It is time now to turn our attention to the other half of medieval aristocratic society, the women who lived within the walls of those castles, who managed the great households of medieval Europe, who raised the children who would become the next generation of knights and ladies, who exercised power that was real and consequential, even when it went largely unrecorded in the chronicles written by and for men. The first thing to understand about noble women in medieval Europe is that their lives were defined above all by their relationship to the institution of marriage. In a society built on the transmission of land and wealth through hereditary succession, women were essential to the system of inheritance that kept the great families going. A noble family without daughters had no daughters to marry to neighboring lords, forging the alliances that were the social cement of the aristocratic world. A noble family without sons needed daughters who could inherit and pass on the family's lands, or alternatively, needed to negotiate marriages that would bring new blood and new resources into the family without losing the family's identity and independence. This made noble women valuable, literally valuable, in ways that their modern counterparts would find deeply uncomfortable. A young woman of good family, with substantial lands and a clean genealogy, was a political and economic asset of the first order. Her hand in marriage was a prize that lords and kings competed to bestow or to withhold, and the choice of her husband was one of the most consequential decisions that her father or guardian could make. It was also, almost always, a decision in which she herself had little formal say. Medieval law, drawing on both Roman tradition and Christian theology, gave fathers and guardians the right to arrange the marriages of their daughters in words, and while their protections against the most grotesque abuses. A father could not legorse his daughter to marry against her. Absolute refusal, the social and economic pressure to accept match was enormous. Marriage, for the medieval nobleman, typically came early. The canonical age of marriage was 12 for women and 14 for men, corresponding to the onset of puberty as medieval people understood it. And while marriages at this age were not universal, they were not common among the nobility, where the political advantages of an early alliance often outweighed the obvious medical risks of early childbearing. The mortality rate among women from childbirth and its complications was very high throughout the medieval period, and younger women faced higher risks than older ones. But the demand for heirs was relentless, and the medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to provide reliable contraception or safe, early obstetric care. Once married, a noble woman's primary obligation was to produce children, specifically, to produce sons who would inherit her husband's lands and title. A wife who failed to produce children, or who produced only daughters, was a source of anxiety and, in extreme cases of formal legal action, annulment on grounds of consanguinity, which in medieval canon law could be established at an extraordinary number of degrees of kinship, was one recourse available to a man who wished to be free of a barren wife. The psychological pressure on married women to conceive and to survive childbirth was enormous, and it colored every aspect of their domestic lives. But the life of a medieval noblewoman was not simply a series of pregnancies. It was also a life of substantial responsibility and, for those of strong character and favorable circumstance, genuine power. The castle household was a complex economic and social institution, employing dozens or hundreds of servants, craftspeople, and dependents, and its efficient functioning required constant attention and capable management. The lord of a great castle was frequently absent, at court, on campaign, on crusade, and in his absence, his wife was the effective ruler of the household, responsible for the production of food and clothing, the care of the sick and the poor, the education of the children, the management of the accounts, and the maintenance of the complex web of social obligations that tied the household to its neighbors, its tenants, and its lord. This managerial responsibility was real and demanding. The chatelaine, the lady of the castle, supervised the activities of the kitchens, the bakehouse, the brewery, the dairy, the garden, and the hall. She managed the household supply of cloth and clothing, in a period before commercially produced textiles were widely available. A great household produced much of its own cloth, and the supervision of spinning and weaving was one of the most labor-intensive of the chatelaine's responsibilities. She oversaw the household accounts, tracking the income from the estate's farms and rents, and the expenditure on food, equipment, and wages for servants. She received visitors, dispensed charity to the poor, and managed the complex politics of a community in which personal relationships were the primary medium of power. In the lord's absence, the chatelaine also had military responsibilities. A castle under siege might well be defended by its lady, not because medieval women were trained as warriors, though some were more capable in this area than others, but because the defense castle was primarily a matter of organization, morale, and strategic judgment rather than personal combat. The historical record includes several notable examples of women who successfully defended their castles against sieges, directing the defense from the battlements, negotiating with besiegers when necessary, and refusing to surrender in the face of pressure that would have broken a less determined defender. Nicola de la Haye is perhaps the most striking English example. As Castellan of Lincoln Castle, she held the fortress against rebel barons and their French allies during the crisis of John's reign and the early years of Henry III, earning the trust and admiration of the royal court and eventually being formally appointed Sheriff of Lincolnshire. One of the very few women to hold such an office in medieval England. Her case illustrates a truth that runs through the history of medieval women: that the formal subordination of women in law and custom did not prevent individual women of exceptional ability from exercising power that was, in practical terms, comparable to that of the most influential men of their era. Chapter 9. Love, Marriage, and Courtly Culture. The culture of courtly love is one of the most debated and most misunderstood aspects of medieval civilization. It has been interpreted as evidence of a refined aesthetic sensibility that transcended the brutality of medieval warfare, as a sophisticated literary game with no necessary connection to actual human behavior, as a mechanism of social control that idealized women while keeping them firmly subordinate, and as a genuine attempt to redefine the relationship between men and women within the constraints of a patriarchal society. All of these interpretations contain some truth. None of them captures the full complexity of a cultural phenomenon that developed over several centuries, took different forms in different social contexts, and meant different things to different people. The origins of courtly love poetry lie in the south of France, in the lyric tradition of the troubadours, the poet-musicians of Provence who, in the late 11th century, developed a new style of vernacular verse in which the central theme was the love of a knight or nobleman for a woman, who was typically married to someone else, therefore unavailable. This love, fin amour, refined love, the troubadours called it, was idealized as a force that ennobled the lover, inspiring him to greater courage, greater courtesy, greater generosity, and greater spiritual refinement. The lady was the source and object of this refinement, and her effect on her devotee was analogous to the effect of divine grace on the Christian soul. It elevated and transformed him, making him more than he could be on his own. The great question about courtly love, whether it involved actual sexual relations between the lovers, is one that historians have debated without consensus for generations. Some scholars argue that fin amour was deliberately and consistently non-consummated, that the whole point was the refinement that came from unfulfilled desire, and that physical consummation would have destroyed the dynamic of aspiration and denial that gave the tradition its energy. Others argue that the elaborate conventions of secrecy and concealment that surrounded courtly love poetry would have been unnecessary if there were no actual secret to conceal, and that at least some of what the poets described reflected real relationships with real sexual dimensions. The truth is probably that, like most human phenomena, the practice of courtly love varied enormously from one individual situation to another. Some relationships between knights and the ladies they served were purely literary, the conventions of courtly love providing a shared framework of language and gesture that enriched the social life of the court, without involving anything more transgressive than the exchange of poems and occasional dance. Others almost certainly involve genuine romantic and sexual entanglement, with all the risks of discovery, scandal, and violence that such entanglement entailed in a society where a woman's sexual honor was her most important social asset. The troubadours themselves were a remarkably diverse group. Some were great nobles. William Eyx, Duke of Aquitaine, is conventionally regarded as the first troubadour, and he was one of the most powerful lords in France. Others were men of modest origin who made their living by composing and performing verse at the courts of the great. Among them were several women, the troubadourettes, as female troubadour poets were known, who composed verse in the same tradition as their male counterparts, giving voice to the experience of love from the feminine perspective with a directness and psychological acuity that is extraordinarily compelling across the centuries. The Countess of Dia, whose given name is uncertain, left us a small number of poems that are among the most vivid expressions of feminine desire in medieval literature. In them, she complains of a lover who has withdrawn his affections, expresses her longing for the physical as well as the emotional dimension of love, and asserts, with a confidence that must have been remarkable in its social context, her own right to desire and to be desired. These are not the poems of a woman who sees herself as merely a passive object of masculine aspiration. They are the poems of a subject, a person who experiences the world actively and who demands, within the framework of the courtly tradition, some recognition of her own complexity and agency. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the granddaughter of William Mailleix and inherited his domains, along with what seems to have been something of his cultural sensibility, is perhaps the most famous poemist of courtly love culture in the 12th century. As Queen of France and later Queen of England, and for a period as an independent ruler of her own domains, she presided over courts that were centers of literary and musical culture, attracting poets and musicians from across the French-speaking world. The figure of the courts of love, hypothetical judicial assemblies at which questions of love and chivalric conduct were debated and adjudicated, presided over by great ladies, is sometimes attributed to Eleanor and her daughter Marie de Champagne, though whether such courts actually met in a formal sense or whether they were more of a literary conceit has been disputed. What is not disputed is the enormous influence of Eleanor and the culture she represented on the development of courtly love literature. It was at the court of her daughter Marie de Champagne that Chrétien Troyes wrote his great Arthurian romances, which shaped the literary representation of knighthood and love for centuries. And it was through the spread of Angevin cultural influence, as Eleanor's descendants ruled England and maintained their French domains, that the troubadour tradition spread from Provence to the north, and eventually to England, Germany, and Italy, generating in each region distinctive literary traditions that were variations on the same fundamental themes. The Arthurian legend, which became the dominant mythology of the knightly class in the 12th century, and remained central to aristocratic culture throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, was intimately bound up with the themes of courtly love. King Arthur's court at Camelot was depicted as the ideal realization of chivalric values, a community of the greatest knights, united in service to their king and to a shared vision of honor and justice. But the legend was also, at its heart, a story about the destructive power of desire. The love between Lancelot, the greatest knight in the world, and Guinevere, Arthur's queen, was the fault that destroyed Camelot, the crack in the perfect structure which the rot spread until the whole edifice collapsed. This tragic dimension of the Arthurian legend was not accidental. It reflected a genuine cultural anxiety about the tensions between the martial values of loyalty and service and the primal attachments that threatened those values. A knight who loved his lord's wife was divided against himself in the most fundamental way. His loyalty to his lord demanded that he suppress and conceal his passion, but the courtly tradition told him that his love for a great lady ennobled him and was the source of his finest qualities. The resolution of this tension was, the Arthurian legend suggested, ultimately impossible, and the attempt to resolve it ended in catastrophe for everyone involved. This did not make the ideal any less attractive. The stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde, of many another ill-fated pair of lovers, were among the most popular literary productions of the medieval period, copied and recopied in manuscripts across Europe, translated from language to language, performed by minstrels at court. Ballad-like, their very sadness was part of their appeal. In a world where marriages were arranged for political and economic reasons, where the choice of a spouse was rarely a matter of personal inclination, the stories of people who loved with absolute devotion and suffered absolutely for that love touched something deep in the human heart. Chapter 10: Queens and Power. Woman woe ruled the image of the medieval woman as purely passive, as an object of male desire and a subject of male authority with no agency of her own, is one of the great distortions of historical memory. Medieval law was certainly weighted against women. Medieval theology, drawing on a long tradition of misogynistic writing, often depicted women as inferior to men, morally weaker, intellectually limited, dangerously susceptible to the temptations of the flesh. And medieval social custom reinforced these theoretical subordinates in countless practical ways. But the history of medieval Europe is also the history of women who governed kingdoms, who commanded armies, who negotiated the most sensitive diplomatic transactions of their age, who wrote works of theology and mysticism that shaped the intellectual life of their era, and who exercised influence on the political and cultural development of their world that no serious historian can afford to overlook. The gap between the theory of female subordination and the practice of female power is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval civilization. The theoretical basis for female rule in medieval Europe was deeply ambiguous. On one hand, women could inherit land and title. If a lord died without male heirs, his estate passed to his daughters. This meant that daughters of great lords could inherit great estates, and with those estates came the political and military responsibilities that went with them. On the other hand, the assumption that governance and military command were masculine functions created a persistent tension around female rulers that never fully resolved itself. The history of Eleanor of Aquitaine illustrates both the opportunities and the constraints that shaped the lives of powerful medieval women. Born around 1122, Eleanor was the daughter and eventual heiress of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, one of the largest and wealthiest lordships in France. When William died on pilgrimage in 1137, leaving Eleanor as his sole heir at the age of approximately 15, she immediately became the most sought-after bride in Europe. Within weeks of her father's death, she was married to the future King Louis of France, making the French king also the ruler of Aquitaine. The marriage was not a happy one. Eleanor was witty, strong-willed, and educated in the sophisticated culture of the South. Louis was pious, indecisive, and temperamentally incapable of appreciating what he had. They took the cross together for the Second Crusade in 1147, and the expedition turned disastrous in ways that damaged their marriage irreparably. Their relationship was subsequently annulled in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity, and Eleanor was free, briefly, to marry her own affairs. Within weeks of the annulment, she had married Henry Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, who was 2 years her junior and who would become, 2 years later, King Henry II of England. Eleanor was now Queen of England, adding that kingdom to the Duchy of Aquitaine she had brought from her first marriage. She was also a mother of remarkable productivity. She bore Henry 8 children who survived to adulthood, including 2 who would become kings, Richard I and John, and 1 daughter, Eleanor, who would become Queen of Castile. Eleanor's later life was marked by conflict with Henry. A conk that eventually led her to support the rebellion of her sons against their father in 173 and 174. When the rebellion failed, Henry imprisoned her, not in a dungeon but in comfortable, aristocratic confinement, where she remained for 15 years. The imprisonment illustrated both the power that Henry held over his wife and the degree of that power's failure. Henry could confine Eleanor, but he could not reduce her to insignificance. She was too important politically, too connected diplomatically, and too personally formidable to be simply erased from the political landscape. When Henry died in 108-89, Eleanor emerged from confinement to play a central role in establishing her son Richard on the throne and in managing the affairs of England during his prolonged absences on crusade and in captivity. She was by this time in her late 60s, an extraordinary age for the medieval period, and her energy and political acuity showed no signs of diminishing. She traveled to Germany to negotiate Richard's release from captivity. She worked to prevent the usurpation of her youngest son John. She managed the complex politics of the Angevin Empire with a skill and experience that no one else in the family could match. She was not unique. The history of medieval Europe is full of women who exercised comparable power in comparable circumstances. Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France twice, once during her son Louis X's minority, and once during his crusade, was one of the most effective rulers of her era, maintaining order in a kingdom torn by baronial conflict, and establishing the foundations of royal administration that her son would build upon. Matilda of Tuscany, who held vast territories in northern Italy, and was a fierce champion of the papal cause in the investiture controversy, combined military and diplomatic skills with a religious devotion that made her one of the most powerful figures in 11th century Europe. Marguerite de Boulogne, Ermengarde of Narbonne, Countess Adela of Blois. The list of medieval women who governed territories, managed complex political relationships, and exercised power that was recognized and respected by their contemporaries is long. These women were not exceptions who proved the rule of female subordination. They were evidence that the rule was always more permeable in practice than in theory. That the social structures of medieval Europe created spaces for female agency that the formal ideology did not acknowledge. Chapter 11. Mystics and Scholars. Women of the mind beyond the castle and the court. Medieval Europe offered another space in which women could exercise a kind of authority not available to them in the secular world: the religious life. For women of intelligence, ambition, and spiritual intensity, the church, and specifically the convent, provided an alternative to the domestic role of wife and mother that was, in some ways, more intellectually and personally fulfilling than marriage to a lord they had not chosen. The medieval convent was not simply a place of retreat from the world. At its best, it was an institution of education, scholarship, and administration that gave women access to the literate Latin culture that was otherwise almost exclusively masculine. A nun in a well-endowed convent had access to books in the Middle Ages, an extraordinary privilege, and to the teachers who could help her read them. She could develop skills in writing, in music, in the arts of illumination and embroidery, and occasionally in medicine and natural science, that the domestic life of a noblewoman seldom allowed. And the most remarkable women of the medieval convents were not merely educated. They were creative, original thinkers whose contributions to the intellectual life of their era deserve far more attention than they have typically received. Hildegard of Bingen, who lived from 1098 to 179 and served for much of her life as abbess of a convent she had founded on the banks of the Rhine, is perhaps the most extraordinary of these women. Hildegard's range of intellectual activity was astonishing even by the standards of a century that celebrated encyclopedic knowledge. She composed music, some of the most complex and beautiful vocal music of the medieval period, and the texts for which that music served as setting. She wrote 3 major works of visionary theology, describing in elaborate and often startling imagery the visions she had experienced since childhood and drawing from them a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between God, humanity, and the created world. She wrote treatises on natural history and medicine, drawing on both the classical tradition and her own observation that were used by physicians for centuries after her death. She also corresponded extensively and with remarkable frankness with the most powerful people of her era, with popes and emperors, with kings and bishops, with the heads of great monasteries, and the leaders of reform movements. Her letters were not merely polite exchanges. They were often sharply critical of the failings she perceived in her correspondence, written within authority that derived not from political power, but from her claim to speak as the instrument of divine revelation. A woman who claimed to speak the word of God, a woman who could not easily be dismissed, even by the most powerful men of her age. Christine de Pizan, who lived at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries, and who is often described as the first professional woman writer in European history, is another extraordinary figure. Born in Venice, but raised in France at the court of Charles V, Christine was widowed young and was left with the responsibility of supporting herself and her children. She turned to writing, a practically unprecedented choice for a woman of her social position, and over the course of a remarkably productive career produced works of poetry, history, political theory, and feminist argument that had a substantial impact on the intellectual culture of her time. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1405, was a systematic refutation of misogynistic literary tradition that depicted women as morally inferior to men. Drawing on a vast range of examples from history and legend, Christine constructed an imaginary city populated entirely by virtuous women, queens and warriors, scholars and saints, artists and administrators, whose lives demonstrated that the supposed vices of women were the products of bad education and social prejudice rather than inherent female nature. The City of Ladies was not only a work of feminist argument, it was a work of historical scholarship, drawing on Christine's extensive reading in Latin and French to assemble the evidence for her case. It circulated widely in manuscript and was among the first books to be printed in France. Julian of Norwich, the English mystic, who lived through much of the 14th century, produced in her Revelations of Divine Love one of the most remarkable works of devotional literature in the English language, Julian's Theology, which developed from a series of intense visions she experienced during a serious illness in 320-73, emphasized the love and tenderness of God rather than the fear and judgment that characterized much medieval preaching. Her image of God as mother, nurturing, patient, infinitely compassionate, was a striking departure from the conventional masculine imagery of medieval theology. And her confidence in the ultimate salvation of all humanity, expressed in her famous phrase, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, gave comfort to generations of readers struggling with the darkness of their times. These women, Hildegard, Christine, Julian, and the many others like them, who left less complete records of their intellectual lives, remind us that the medieval world was not simply the world of the knight and the battlefield. It was also a world of intense spiritual and intellectual actual activity, much of it conducted in languages and institutions that are unfamiliar to modern readers, but that were as serious and as rigorous as anything in the contemporary academic world. And women were participants in this intellectual life, not as peripheral figures, not as mere exceptions to a masculine norm, but as full and creative participants in the making of medieval culture. Chapter 12 of The Decline, Hevelry, Gunpowder, and the End of, and in Age All Things End. The world of the medieval knight, the world of the castle and the tournament, the great siege engine and the destrier, the sworn oath, and the sung romance, did not disappear overnight, but it did, over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, undergo a transformation so profound that the knighthood of 1500 was barely recognizable as the descendant of the knighthood of 1100. The forces that brought about this transformation were multiple and interconnected. The most obvious was military technology, specifically the spread of firearms and the consequent obsolescence of the armor that had defined the knight's identity for centuries. Gunpowder had reached Europe from China by the 13th century, and by the mid-14th century, cannon were being deployed in sieges and occasionally in pitched battle. By the early 15th century, small firearms, the predecessors of the musket, were in widespread use. None of these early weapons was particularly accurate or reliable, and none had yet rendered the armored knight obsolete. But the direction of development was clear. The most sophisticated plate armor of the 15th century was designed partly in response to the threat of firearms. The great rounded breastplates and helmets of the late Gothic period were shaped to deflect bullets as well as lance blows. But there was a limit to how thick armor could be made while remaining compatible with mounted combat, and the increasing power of firearms eventually crossed that limit. By the mid-16th century, the knight in full plate was a figure from another age, impressive, certainly, but militarily as obsolete as the chariot. The decline of the knight as the dominant figure on the battlefield was already visible before the widespread adoption of firearms. The effective use of longbowmen and pike formations in the 14th and 15th centuries, at Crécy, at Agincourt, at Granson and Merton, where the Swiss pike squares destroyed the Burgundian cavalry, demonstrated that a force of well-trained and disciplined infantry could defeat mounted knights reliably and repeatedly. The knight remained formidable as an individual fighter, but the tactical dominance of cavalry that made him the supreme military figure of the high medieval period over. The economic and social foundations of knighthood were also eroding. The rise of centralized monarchies, with their ability to raise money through taxation and to hire professional soldiers, gradually displaced the feudal military obligation that had been the social basis of the knightly class. A king who could pay soldiers was not dependent on the military service of his vassals in the way that earlier rulers had been, and professional soldiers could be trained more quickly, deployed more flexibly, and dismissed more easily than the knights who had served on the basis of hereditary obligation. The nature of warfare was changing in other ways too. The gunpowder revolution was not only a matter of individual weapons. It was also a revolution in siege warfare. The massive stone fortifications that had dominated medieval warfare, the great square towers and thick walls that had been proof against earlier siege technology, were vulnerable to cannon fire in a way that no previous weapon had achieved. The entire logic of medieval fortification, which had evolved over centuries in response to the limited destructive power of pre-gunpowder siege engines, was invalidated by artillery. The thick-walled castle was replaced by the Star Fort, a low-profile, angular design that could deflect cannonballs more effectively, and with it went much of the romance of the fortified stronghold. Yet chivalry did not simply disappear. It transformed itself. The code of honor that had governed the warrior class survived the military and social changes of the 15th and 16th centuries, evolving into the gentlemanly ideal that would shape European aristocratic culture through the early modern period. The tournament became a pageant rather than a training exercise, a spectacular display of horsemanship and martial skill, in which the competitive element was subordinated to the theatrical one. The armorer's craft reached its highest technical and artistic achievements in the very period when military armor was becoming obsolete, producing pieces that were displayed as works of art as much as they were used as protective equipment. The literature of chivalry enjoyed a remarkable renaissance precisely as the reality it described was fading. Malory's Morte d'Arthur, written in the mid-15th century as the old order of English knighthood was being destroyed in the Wars of the Roses, looked back to the world of Arthur and Lancelot with a combination of nostalgia and moral seriousness that gave the tradition a new dimension. The romances of Ariosto and Tasso, written for the courts of Renaissance Italy, celebrated knightly adventure with sophistication and irony that acknowledged the gap between the ideal and the reality while preserving the ideal's emotional power. Cervantes' Don Quixote, published in the early 17th century, is simultaneously the most loving and the most devastating critique of the chivalric tradition. A work in which the ideals of knighthood survive the death of the world that gave them birth, embodied in a ridiculous but touchingly sincere old man teeing at windmills. The legacy of medieval knighthood is still with us, in ways that we might not immediately recognize. The concept of the officer and gentleman in military culture, the ideal of service and self-sacrifice that runs through Western culture's depictions of heroism, the notion that physical courage must be tempered by moral restraint, and that the powerful have a special obligation to protect the weak. All of these are inheritances, however transformed and secularized, from the chivalric tradition of the Middle Ages. The tournament gave us the sporting contest, the idea that competition between individuals or groups can be a theater of values as well as a test of skill, that how you play the game matters as much as whether you win. The courtly love tradition gave us the romantic ideal, the idea that love between a man and a woman should be the central emotional experience of a human life, and that the beloved is worthy of reverence and devotion that transcends the merely physical. These ideas are so deeply embedded in Western culture that we rarely think to ask where they came from, but their origins lie in the extraordinary civilization that flourished in the castles and courts of medieval Europe. Epilogue. The Shadog of the Middle Ages. We have traveled a long road together. From the dark centuries after Rome's fall, through the birth of feudalism and the development of the knight, through the crusades and the tournaments and the great households of the medieval nobility, through the lives of queens who governed and mystics who wrote and noble women who managed the complex machinery of the medieval world, we have seen the ideal and the reality of chivalry, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in sharp contradiction, and we have followed the long decline of a civilization that, for all its cruelty and darkness, produced things of lasting value and beauty. What should we make of it all? The medieval world was neither the golden age of romantic nostalgia, nor the dark age of Protestant propaganda. It was a human civilization, limited by the technology, the knowledge, and the moral horizons of its time, as all civilizations are, but also capable of genuine achievement, genuine beauty, and genuine wisdom. The men and women who lived in it were fully human, as complex, as contradictory, as capable of heroism and cruelty, of love and hatred, of profound faith and brutal cynicism, as any human beings who have ever lived. The knight was not the perfect Christian warrior of the romances, but neither was he merely the brutal hired sword of cynical realpolitik. He was a man shaped by a particular culture, trying, often failing, sometimes succeeding, to live up to ideals that were genuinely demanding and genuinely admirable. The noble woman was not the passive object of courtly verse, but neither was she simply a victim of systematic oppression. She was a person of agency and intelligence, working within the constraints of her world to exercise whatever power was available to her, and sometimes achieving a great deal. The world they inhabited was gone now, replaced by the nations and institutions and technologies of modernity. But its echoes are everywhere, if you know how to listen. In the ceremonial swords of modern military officers, in the language of honor that still shapes how we think about courage and duty, in the stories of King Arthur and his knights that continue to be told and retold in every medium that successive generations have invented, in the cathedrals that still rise above European cities, their stone fingers pointing toward the heaven that their builders believed in absolutely, regardless of what any of us believe today. The Middle Ages are not over. They are simply very far away. And the further away they recede, the more we find ourselves drawn back to them, to the simplicity of their moral landscape, to the intensity of their emotional world, to the stories of men and women who lived, loved, fought, and died in service of values that still speak to something deep in the heart. This has been the story of the knights and ladies of medieval Europe. It is a story of iron and faith, of love and war, of the slow civilizing of human violence, and the enduring human need to find meaning and beauty in the face of suffering and death. It is a story that is never fully finished, because as long as human beings continue to ask how we should live, how we should treat those who are weaker than ourselves, what we owe to those who have trusted us, what price we are willing to pay for honor. The answer of the medieval knight, imperfect and incomplete as it was, remains one of the most serious and most interesting responses that history has to offer. These are the stories we tell each other in the dark. They are the stories we carry with us through the centuries, changing with every retelling, but always pointing back to the same essential human questions. And that is why, 1,000 years after the last Crusader departed the walls of Jerusalem, and 500 years after the last tournament was held in the fields of England, we still find ourselves drawn to the world of the knight and the lady, the castle and the court, the sword and the rose. The Middle Ages speak to us still. Listen carefully, and you will hear them.